planned economies don't work. It's impossible to account for every possibility, and that there are no alternatives to market regulation. Through the influence of propaganda, these cliches have spread throughout society. Few people, however, know what state planning really was, how the planned economy functioned in the USSR, and why it ultimately fell. We will examine all of this here in this video. As we all know, socialist societies would not be able to function while dealing with overproduction crises and the industrial ruin and mass unemployment they bring about. It is unacceptable that people would not be able to purchase vital goods due to the cost of living going up. It is just as unacceptable as profiteering off them in times of high demand. In order to resolve these contradictions, a new state agency was formed in the Soviet Union. The intended purpose of this agency was to begin work on the statewide planning of the national economy and to have control over the implementation of these plans. Now, obviously, the utilization of a planned economy is not a feature exclusive to the socialist system. As we've seen throughout history, state monopoly capitalist systems have demonstrated clearly that capital is more than willing to use elements of economic planning for the express purposes of minimizing risks and extracting maximum profits. This method of economic planning was employed in a number of large imperialist countries: post-war Japan, South Korea during the time of Park Chung-hee, Iran, modern capitalist China. It is worth mentioning the fact that 4-year plans were actively made use of in Nazi Germany, a fact often exploited to draw parallels between fascist and communist regimes. Before moving on with our analysis of the principles of Soviet state planning, it should be made clear that terms such as market economy and planned economy, in the language of contemporary economic science, have become interchangeable with socialism and capitalism. In the way that they are commonly understood, these labels have become extremely abstracted, and in this kind of interpretation, these bourgeois propagandists are able to brand their political rivals as communists. Whilst working on developing the provisions on the national economy during the transitional period of the proletarian dictatorship, Lenin noted that under socialism, what were previously capitalist production relations are then replaced with a planned national economy in which the proletarian state becomes the regulating force. Under capitalism, state planning is limited by and functions according to the interests of the capitalist monopolies. This type of planning is inherently incapable of accounting for an entire country due to its features like competition, the anarchy of production, and the desire by capitalists to maximize their profits. The regulation of the market through the introduction of some planned elements does not change its chaotic and spontaneous nature. This is not regulation in the sense of a reasonably manageable system, as would be the case under socialism, but simply a spontaneous influence that is incapable of coping with the main downfalls of the capitalist system. For example, state planning in the USSR was fundamentally different from the State Planning Committee of Nazi Germany, through which large German industrialists openly controlled the economy in the interests of increasing their capital gains. Unlike the plans made by the capitalists, the socialist national economy necessitates the use of the productive forces of society for the needs of the entirety of the working class. Critics of socialism argue that forming a comprehensive plan is practically impossible. To them, the steady growth in the amount of industries and the complexity of the interconnections between them will constantly complicate an already enormous task. The idea of covering absolutely everything with planning, however, was never the goal. These plans were built on the principle from vague to specific. The smaller and more defined the task, the greater the chances that it can be rectified in the exact areas that attention is needed. Based on the foundations of state planning of the USSR, local structures in the Union republics would draw up their own plans. At the level of regions and districts, these plans were formed through planning commissions, which were then executed directly by the forces of the local enterprises. Developing on Lenin's ideas that a plan is a state assignment to the proletariat, Joseph Stalin further expanded on the nature of Soviet economic plans. Our plans are not forecast plans, not guesswork plans, but directive plans, which are binding upon our leading bodies, and which determine the trend of our future economic development on a countrywide scale. Additionally, The planning mechanisms in the Soviet Union took into account not only directives coming from above, but proposals coming from below as well. The primary advantage of such planning, in compared to capitalist planning, was the participation of the masses of workers in management, which resulted in greater efficiency in problem solving and the elimination of the anarchy of production. Preparing state plans starts with 3 questions. What is there now? What will be needed in the future? How do we go steadily from the present to the future? As an example, the Party Congress decided that the national economy needed more trucks, and had confirmed this by analyzing the figures of the cargo transportation at the time with the growth rates of production and figuring out the growth rate of the cargo turnover. A group of universities was involved in the investigation of whether the automotive industry was capable of producing the required volumes, and, if not, how they could best ensure that the orders were fulfilled. Based on these studies, recommendations were made to expand and modernize the automotive manufacturing enterprises and to proceed with the construction of new enterprises as well. Further, after careful consideration of all the recommendations, the government decided which enterprises to build and develop. As a result, and with new inputs appearing in the state planning process, an order was approved to begin the construction of a new automobile plant. In the 8th and 9th 5-year plans, an agreement was formed to build a factory, now known as the Kama Automobile Plant. For this purpose, both human and material resources were allocated and were mobilized throughout the country. Of course, those tasked with planning were faced with the large-scale task of a massive and complex system of equations, numerous variables, and input from all directions. Technological progress, however, does not stand still, and the use of powerful computers were a great help to the planners responsible for this work. Statistics were responsible for the accuracy and completeness of all the data. They are what supplied the input for the tasks, and were the most important node of the nervous system of the planned economy. The young Soviet state came face to face with the monumental task of transforming a predominantly agrarian country with weak and minimal industry into a world beacon of socialism. Industrialization and the growing use of electricity became some of the indisputable achievements of state planning. Discussing these global projects, Lenin put forward an article in 1922 on a single economic plan in which the provisions were outlined and later became the basis of the work of the USSR State Planning Committee. The task of the communists inside the Goelro is to issue few orders, rather, to refrain from issuing any at all, and to be very tactful in their dealings with the scientists and technicians. The task is to learn from them, and to help them to broaden their worldview on the basis of achievements in their particular field, always bearing in mind that the engineer's way of communism is different from that of the underground propagandist and the writer. He is guided along by the evidence of his own science, so that the agronomist, the forestry expert, etc., each have their own path to tread towards communism. The communist who has failed to prove his ability to bring together and guide the work of specialists in a spirit of modesty, going to the heart of the matter and studying it in detail, is a potential menace. The construction of Goelro became a crucial point in the emergence of a planned national economy. It was the first plan of strategic importance in the world that held popular nationwide support. It was voted for at the 8th All-Russian Congress of Soviets, and then approved at the 9th All-Russian Congress. Within the framework of the global strategic project Goelro, the production of electricity managed to increase from 2 all the way to 13 billion kilowatt hours in only 19 years. The first chairman of the State Planning Commission, Gleb Krzyzhanovsky, was able to attract over 200 scientists and engineers to the electrification project in the shortest possible time. As a result of the adoption of this plan, the Soviet Union achieved a powerful breakthrough in the country's power supply. Starting with 33 power plants in 1913, their number had already risen to 858 by 1927, and consumption increased from 427,000 kilowatt hours up to 10 million kilowatt hours. In talking about industrialization and electrification, the anti-communists point to the participation of foreign specialists, announcing that successes in the USSR were the result of economic participation of private American companies in the construction of leading Soviet enterprises. Interestingly, anti-communists prefer to remain silent on the leading role of the CPSU, which was not only responsible for hiring the foreign specialists, but also actively trained its own workforce. The communists learned the basics of management from said specialists and taught them to Soviet workers and engineers, while retaining the leading role in the construction of socialism. Stalin's industrialization made it so that as quickly as reasonably possible, more than 2 million engineers were educated and heavy industry was developed, making the USSR independent from the capitalist world. In under 30 years, the American bourgeoisie would be forced to admit that they lagged behind the Soviet Union in the field of science and technology. Thanks to the planned development of all economic sectors, many areas of the national economy had achieved success. By the 1970s, the USSR had become one of the leaders in the automotive industry and cement production, and the pace of widespread introduction of computer systems had put the Soviet Union on par with Japan and the United States. Valerian Kuybyshev, who was in charge of state planning, remarked in a report at the 17th conference of the All-Union Communist Party of Bolsheviks regarding the second 5-year plan. The essence of the plan is precisely that it must show not only what needs to be achieved in the end, but also shows how to do it, what instruments are needed to fulfill the plan, and how implementation should unfold in real time. An economic plan that is drawn up and executed correctly means sustainable development without crises, and the ability to build truly ambitious and long-term projects. The planned implementation of a socialist national economy is closely tied to the broad participation of the working people in the role of economic management. This precisely is the central difference between the socialist and capitalist mode of production, the latter of which implicitly implies the alienation of workers from the control of the means of production. When we say workers' control, always juxtaposing this slogan to dictatorship of the proletariat, always putting it immediately after the latter, we thereby explain what kind of state we mean. The state is the organ of class domination. Of which class? If it is of the proletariat, if we are speaking of a proletarian state, that is, of the proletarian dictatorship, then workers' control can become the countrywide, all-embracing, omnipresent, most precise, and most conscientious accounting of the production and distribution of goods. Having destroyed the exploiting classes, the USSR tirelessly established and amplified the role of the Soviet workers in the control of the Soviet national economy. It was carried out by the working people, not just from above, but also from below. Following Lenin's words that workers' control and management of production should be carried out with the appropriate combination of strong leadership and collective effort, the construction of socialism in the USSR continued on with the employment of regularly held meetings on production. It was this practice that allowed the workers' collectives to exercise control over both the administration at the enterprise, as well as the opportunity to discuss the positive and negative aspects of the next 5-year plan. This tendency only intensified over the following years. For example, if in the years of 1926 to 1927, in the city of Leningrad alone, roughly 12,000 proposals were submitted during the conferences, of which 2/3 were accepted, then in 1965, more than 30 million workers took part in the conferences throughout the USSR, and about 1.5 million proposals were accepted. While studying the state planning in the USSR, one cannot ignore the questions of deficits and the decline of the planned economy. On the one hand, deficits in the USSR did exist. However, it is completely absurd to assert that it is a characteristic exclusive to socialist countries, or that it is an inevitable consequence to the foundations of a planned economy. Beginning with the Kosygin reforms, where profitability was the cornerstone of production, the weakening of the class struggle ultimately led to a steady, gradual increase in capitalist deviations within the Soviet economy. The petty bourgeois elements, which had been strengthened, hoped to chip away at their chunks of profit and strive for industrial autonomy. Their resistance against the centralization of the means of production led to the emergence of the syndicalist phenomenon in the late years of the USSR. Despite the fact that it is technically a part of the labor movement, syndicalism tends to act against the dictatorship of the proletariat. Syndicalism is characterized by the idea of self-governance, and the autonomization of enterprises, while the dictatorship of the proletariat is based on the centralization of the socialized means of production. Syndicalism began to develop especially actively during the years of perestroika. In the late 1980s, production cooperatives had become the primary legal and organizational form of entrepreneurial activity in the USSR, which was explained by the decline in production accompanied by an increase in the average income of the population. Statistics indicate an increase in the circulation of money and an insufficient amount of consumer goods, which resulted in shortages and long queues outside of stores. This leads us to the simplest possible conclusion that it was specifically the market elements that were reintroduced to the economy which are to blame for the escalation of consumer goods shortages. The anarchy of production, as described by the classics of Marxism-Leninism, was inflated to the level of perestroika counter-revolution. Kilometer-long queues, as it turns out, are the product of the late perestroika USSR and were not at all characteristic during its rise. Thus, the reasons for the eventual failures and disappearance of the planned national economy cannot be found at all in the period of increased centralization, but, on the contrary, in the departure from the original principles and in the desire to introduce market elements into the socialist economy. The final blow to the planned economy would be the law on cooperative property. At this point in time, we are on the verge of new upheavals. The productive forces and productive relations of the modern capitalist system will soon enter into an inevitable contradiction with each other, undoubtedly exacerbating the class struggle. Even technological progress, which has carried the hopes of bourgeois ideologists, did not resolve the contradictions, but has instead exacerbated them. The modern state of the productive forces, with its 3D printers, the internet, and advanced robotics, under capitalism, is inevitably weighed down by the massive impoverishment of workers and the transfer of production to the overexploited third world countries, where the cruel dictatorship of capital reigns. Only a planned national economy will make it possible to direct progress towards welfare of all mankind. Stay tuned.